The following is a brief summary of the four prophesied destructions that will occur during the Common Era. The pattern of the three that have already occurred is examined, and then that pattern applied to the fourth, which is on the horizon. Unfortunately, for too many of our young viewers, they will live through those events. Hi, Rex Hudson here for the Yahweh. Today we're going to talk about the stars of the Plow, which is just an English translation for a document called the Mula Pen. And it was a summary, a compendium, if you will, of the astronomy knowledge of the Mesopotamians from ancient times. The illustration on the screen right now is of the Dendera zodiac. And there you see actually the plow itself in the dead center of the screen. The jackal rides on the beam, and a hippopotamus is directing the plow. It's a somewhat confused image, but it's one of the reasons why scholars believe this is taken from a more ancient Mesopotamian illustration that has been lost to history. Author Gavin White, in his book Babylonian Star Lore, kind of summarizes up this image as the most ancients observed it, and that is the plow in the dead center. You see a wolf or a jackal riding the beam of the plow, and on either side of it, the two constellations the ancients called the wagons, the big wagon and the little wagon. We know them today as the Big Bear, Big Dipper, Little Dipper, but you see the idea. Now, the agricultural motif comes screaming through this if you think about it for a second. In the Mesopotamian area or throughout the Mideast, there were actually two grain harvests each year. The summer crop was harvested in the fall. That was a major event, probably represented by the big wagon. And then there was a smaller winter crop that was harvested in the early spring, and that represented by the little wagon. Now, I've read many fascinating things about what on earth is the jackal doing riding the plow. And all I can tell you is those scholars are not farm boys, because as a farm boy, I know instantly. When you plow a piece of ground, you turn it over, you dislodge the burrows of mice and rats and gophers, etc. In no time at all, you'll be followed by a retinue of wild animals, coyotes and vultures and others that will arrive to feast on the harvest you're turning over in the process, a motif which we'll explore in more detail later. Anyway, here we see the illustration from, again, using the timeline of the Torah. We can say that the event we know as Noah's flood occurs in 2303 BC, and that perfectly aligns at that moment with true north and the star Megrez, which is, if you will, the joining of the tongue of the wagon to the body of the big wagon. Now, we tend to treat this as a mythological event, but as we've talked about in other presentations, there's actually a 2-mile wide meteor impact crater located in what would have been the shallow sea off the coast of Mesopotamia, and it dates from approximately this window in time. I say approximately because we've not been fully explored because of the war in the area, etc. But anyway, it seems to have hit in a shallow sea. You can imagine the waves that would have been thrown onto the ground, onto the earth at that point, and you imagine the water falling back down in the form of a rain. This is an actual event we have recorded in history. Now, I won't go through the details of how we move from the Big Dipper, the big wagon, to Little Wagon, but here we are at exactly the same position on the Little Wagon. In other words, the joining of the body of the wagon to the tongue of the wagon, a star called Zeta Ursa Minoris. We can date a perfect match to approximately 1 BC. Now, remember, our zodiac alignments took us to two dates, 70 AD and 137 AD. So this is a date at the beginning of a process and rather than the end. So what begins in 1 BC? Well, the answer to that is simple. That's the date in which the Romans dropped all pretense of being, if you will, helpful advisors or assistants to the government of Israel, and following the death of Herod and the riots and rebellions that followed, they took over actually control of the nation and stationed their legions in Rome itself. This triggers a cascade of events, and this is a process the Roman had done successfully in many other countries. But the Jews are a stiff-necked people, as they say, and they, as a result of this takeover, start a series of two things. One is rebellions against the leadership of the Romans, and secondly, what's called Messianic fever. There's a whole series of people who rise up claiming to be messiahs in the time immediately following after this. That is endless troubles for the Romans, and it culminates in basically three events. First event is what we call the First Jewish War, ends in 70 CE with the Jews being expelled from their capital city of Jerusalem. The next event is actually more damaging to the Romans than the Jews, and that's the Kittos Rebellion, which results in the death of about 400,000 Roman civilians. And then the third event, a large event, is the Bar Kokhba War, and that this illustration is of the letters that have been found in what's called the Cave of Letters, of his exhortations to his commanders to fight even harder as the war starts moving against them. He eventually is killed, the nation destroyed, and basically the Jews were expelled from the Holy Lands for the next 1,800 years, with very small exceptions. From there, we go to the next star on the handle of the Little Dipper, the Little Wagon, and that takes us to the date of 1321 CE. Now, this seems a little odd. This is after the Mongol Wars and that ravaged the Asian continent. What's going on? We get a hint in this plaque. The Black Death entered England in 1348 through this port. It killed 30 to 50% of the country's total population. This is a fascinating event, as horrific as it is, because the Doomsday Book, which is actually a textual compendium, records the result of this in great detail, and scholars have studied it to a large extent. What we discover is that whole towns disappear because there's simply not enough people left behind to occupy them. In Venice, Italy, the government puts out a note that if you'll just move into a house and clean it up and bury the bodies inside, you can have it. It's a devastating event in Europe, but we discover that it actually, like so many plagues before it and after, it actually originates in China many years earlier and slowly moves across the continent until it arrives finally in Europe, and from Europe even to England. Anyway, estimates are vary, but it's somewhere between 75 to 200 million people die as this disease covers the earth. And estimates are that populations were set back almost 200 years before they recovered back to their previous levels. And it changes societies all over the known world. The next alignment occurs in 1914. Now remember, the zodiac alignment ends in 1949, so what's happening in 1914 that signals the beginning of troubles? And the answer is partially found in this photograph. My apologies, I can't give perfect attribution to it, but it's the moment that war is announced to the Germans, and the excited crowds are cheering the results. The blow up on it is a focus on a very, very young man with a mustache, Adolf Schicklgruber. And Adolf is so excited, he enlists in the army, he's sent to the front, he becomes a messenger runner, a very, very dangerous role to play, to carry messages back and forth. He has many near brushes with death, is injured at one point, but he leaves the war with a messianic fever. He believes he has survived for a great purpose, and that great purpose is to take over the government of Germany. And he proceeds to do exactly that over the course of time. So we can trace that disaster back to perhaps this moment. There's a second event which occurs, and that is the German government, wanting to foment problems for its enemies, sends a group of disaffected intellectuals to Russia. They call themselves communists, but they're a variation on socialist. So just as Adolf Hitler creates the National Socialists in Germany, they create the Union of Socialist States in Russia, and unbelievably actually take over the country, and if that's not bad enough, spread the disease to China and other nations. Before this disaster is over, the socialist wars have claimed over 200 million lives in another great disaster of history. If we go forward in time to our own date, we see we're almost to the final star in the handle of the dipper, or if you will, in the tongue of the wagon, and that's Polaris. Polaris is moving towards being the North Star, and it will complete that journey in approximately 2118, 100 years in our future. Now, I'm often asked, is this a prophecy of disaster? Absolutely. Can this disaster be prevented? I honestly don't know. Can you prepare for this disaster? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. But more than that, I can't say. But what I can say is this. If you're Jewish, go home. Go home now.